The word Kemet has become one of the most controversial names in history. Some say it proves ancient Egypt was something the world refuses to admit. Others say its meaning has been twisted, misused, and turned into a modern battlefield. Social media, documentaries, and even books repeat the word again and again, but rarely explain what the ancient Egyptians themselves actually meant when they wrote it on temple walls more than 5,000 years ago. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. Kemet was never a mystery to the people who lived there. It was not a secret code. It was not a hidden identity. And it was not created to explain race, power, or dominance. Yet today, this single word has become one of the most misunderstood terms in ancient history, pulled out of its original context and forced into modern arguments that did not exist in the ancient world. Ancient Egyptian priests carved the word Kemet into stone during a time when survival itself depended on one thing: the Nile. Every year, the river flooded, leaving behind a dark, fertile soil that made life possible in the middle of one of the harshest deserts on Earth. Without this land, Egypt would never have existed. And this is where the real story begins, not with ideology, but with geography, survival, and a civilization fighting chaos itself. So before we accept what modern voices claim Kemet means, we need to go back, not to opinions, but to hieroglyphs, ancient texts, and how the Egyptians understood their own world. Because once we strip away modern arguments, the true meaning of Kemet tells a story far more powerful than any myth, a story about life, order, and why this civilization survived for over 3,000 years. This is Beyond Time. Don't forget to subscribe in the channel and hit the like button if you are looking for the truth. To understand what Kemet meant, we must stop thinking like modern people and start thinking like ancient Egyptians. In hieroglyphs, the word was written as KMT, a term that appears clearly in religious texts, royal inscriptions, and administrative records. Linguistically, the word means the Black Land, but the meaning does not stop at translation. For the ancient Egyptians, land was not just territory, land was survival, identity, and divine order. The color black referred to the rich, dark soil left behind by the Nile floods every year, a soil so fertile that it could grow crops in the middle of an otherwise lifeless desert. This black soil was the reason Egypt could exist at all. While most of the surrounding regions were dry and unforgiving, the Nile transformed a narrow strip of land into one of the most productive agricultural zones in the ancient world. When Egyptians said Kemet, they were describing this life-giving environment, not a symbolic idea and not a human characteristic. Ancient texts consistently use Kemet to describe the land itself, often in contrast with the desert, and never as a description of people's appearance or ancestry. What makes this important is that the ancient Egyptians were precise with language. They had different words for people, nations, foreigners, and regions. If Kemet had meant something else, we would see it clearly explained in their texts. Instead, what we find again and again is that Kemet was the physical foundation of Egyptian civilization. It was the land where order existed, where crops grew, where temples stood, and where the gods were believed to maintain balance in the world. Kemet cannot be understood alone. It only makes sense when placed next to its opposite, Deshret, the Red Land. Deshret was the desert that surrounded Egypt on all sides, a hostile environment associated with danger, death, and chaos. Ancient Egyptians did not see the desert as empty or neutral. They saw it as a threat, a place where enemies came from and where survival was almost impossible. This contrast between Kemet and Deshret shaped how Egyptians understood the universe itself. Inside Kemet, there was agriculture, cities, temples, and law. Outside it, there was instability. This is why Egyptian art and texts often associate the desert with disorder and link it to the god Set, who represented chaos and disruption. Meanwhile, Kemet was connected to Ma'at, the principle of balance, truth, and cosmic order that held the universe together. Living in Kemet meant living inside Ma'at, protected by the Nile and the gods. This division was not symbolic in a modern sense, it was lived reality. The survival of Egypt depended on keeping the desert at bay and maintaining control over the fertile land. When Egyptians defended their borders, they were not just defending territory, they were defending order itself. Kemet was the center of existence, surrounded by forces that constantly threatened to destroy it. To truly understand Kemet, we must understand how the ancient Egyptians understood identity itself, because this is where most modern interpretations completely collapse. The ancient Egyptians did not think in terms of race, color, or identity the way the modern world does. These categories simply did not exist in their intellectual framework. Instead, identity was defined through culture, geography, and one's relationship to order, or what they called Ma'at. To belong was not about how someone looked, but about how they lived and where they stood within the system of Kemet. Ancient Egyptian texts clearly distinguish between different peoples, but the distinctions are always cultural and geographical. Nubians are described as people from the south, Libyans from the west, and Asiatics from the east. These descriptions focus on clothing, weapons, customs, and behavior, not skin color. When Egyptians depicted foreigners in art, they exaggerated cultural features to make them recognizable, not to rank them biologically. The goal was identification, not classification in a modern racial sense. What truly mattered to the Egyptians was whether someone existed inside or outside the moral and cosmic order of Kemet. Inside Kemet was Ma'at, balance, truth, agriculture, law, and divine protection. Outside Kemet was Isfet, chaos, instability, and danger. This worldview shaped everything from religion to politics. Foreign lands were not seen as inferior because of people, but because they existed outside the life-sustaining environment of the Nile. Civilization, in the Egyptian mind, was environmental before it was ideological. This is why Egypt could absorb foreigners over time without collapsing its identity. Nubians served as generals, priests, and officials. Libyans settled in the delta and eventually ruled as dynasties. Asiatics lived, traded, and worked inside Egyptian cities. Once these groups adopted Egyptian language, worship, and customs, they were no longer treated as outsiders. They became part of Kemet. Identity was fluid, conditional, and cultural, not fixed or biological. Even the king himself was defined by Kemet, not ethnicity. The pharaoh was the living embodiment of Ma'at, responsible for keeping order within the Black Land and protecting it from the chaos beyond its borders. His legitimacy did not come from blood alone, but from his ability to maintain balance. When Egypt fell into disorder, texts describe it not as a failure of people, but as a breakdown of Ma'at, a cosmic imbalance that threatened existence itself. This is also why modern attempts to turn Kemet into a racial or ideological statement fail when compared to primary sources. The ancient Egyptians never used the word Kemet to describe people. They used it to describe the land that made life possible. Their identity was tied to the Nile's rhythm, the seasons, the floods, and the fragile boundary between fertility and death. Kemet was never about exclusion. It was about survival. It was the recognition that civilization exists only when humans live in harmony with their environment and maintain balance against chaos. This idea, carved into temples and written in sacred texts, is the real legacy of ancient Egypt, and it is far more complex and far more human than any modern argument attached to the word today. When we strip away modern arguments, social media debates, and political projections, the meaning of Kemet becomes clear in a way that is both simple and unsettling. Kemet was never created to explain identity, power, or ideology. It was a name born from survival. A thin strip of black soil surrounded by endless desert managed to support one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. The ancient Egyptians did not name their land to impress the future. They named it to describe the miracle that allowed them to live at all. This is why Kemet still matters today, not because it proves a modern point, but because it reminds us how fragile civilization really is. Egypt existed because balance was maintained between the river and the land, between order and chaos, between humanity and nature. When that balance was threatened, the Egyptians believed the universe itself was in danger. Kemet was not just geography, it was a responsibility. To protect the land was to protect life, truth, and cosmic order. Perhaps the reason Kemet has become so controversial in the modern world is because we no longer think this way. We search for identity in symbols instead of systems, in labels instead of balance. The ancient Egyptians understood that civilization does not survive because of who we are, but because of how we live. Kemet was their reminder that order must be maintained every day, or chaos will always return. So the real question is not what Kemet means to us now, but whether we are willing to understand it on its own terms. As the land where life stood its ground against chaos, Kemet offers a lesson that goes far beyond ancient Egypt. It asks us to rethink how civilizations rise, how they survive, and why they eventually fall. And maybe that is the real reason this word still echoes across history, because Kemet is not just the name of a place that once existed. It is a warning carved in stone from a civilization that understood how close life always is to the edge of chaos.